Shadows stretched across the walls of a place meant to erase hope, where every sound carried the weight of finality and every glance told a story of judgment. In the middle of that silence, one choice, unexpected, almost ordinary, set into motion, a chain of events that would tear open secrets no courtroom ever revealed. What began as a farewell turned into something far greater, something that forced even the coldest hearts to stop and listen. Before the truth unfolds, hold on to the questions stirring inside you, because the answers will strike harder than you imagine. If you want to follow stories that challenge your expectations, remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments what twists you anticipate and the place you are watching from. Monica Johnson, a black woman on death row, sat quietly on the edge of her cot, her back against the cold cement wall, the fluorescent light above her humming like a reminder that her final hours were slipping away. She was 40, her hair streaked with gray, not from age alone but from years of stress and sorrow carved deep into her life. Born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, Monica had grown up in a working-class black family where her mother's voice had been both a lullaby and a warning, urging her to be twice as good in a world that judged her skin before her actions. For 7 years she had lived behind bars, sentenced to die for a crime she swore she had not committed, and though the years had stripped her of freedom, they had not stripped her of her dignity. Now, with only hours before her execution, she was told she could choose a last request, and what she chose would not only shock the guards, but begin to unravel a truth that prejudice had buried. The guards expected her to follow the pattern of others before her: fried chicken, steak and potatoes, pecan pie, or a call to a family member. But Monica had no appetite for food and no family left to hear her voice. Her mother had died while she was locked away, her brother had vanished into silence, ashamed of the headlines that painted his sister as a killer. The state had not only stolen her life, it had stolen her place in her family's story. Still, Monica had one memory untouched, a memory so powerful that even prison walls could not erase it: her dog, Duke. Duke was a golden Labrador with soft brown eyes, a dog she had rescued from a dumpster as a scrawny pup. Over the years, he had become her shadow, her protector, her silent anchor in a life often marked by hardship. When nights grew too long and despair threatened to consume her, Duke would press his head against her lap, reminding her that loyalty could survive in a world filled with betrayal. The day she was arrested, Duke had been dragged away by animal control, his eyes wide with confusion and pain. That look haunted her through every sleepless night. When the warden came to her cell that morning, clipboard in hand, his face carved from years of dealing with condemned souls, he asked the ritual question, "What do you want for your last request?" Monica lifted her chin, her voice steady though her heart pounded. "I want to see Duke," she said. The warden blinked, uncertain if he had heard her correctly. "Your dog?" "Yes, my dog. He's all I have left." Outside the cell, 2 guards exchanged amused smirks. One whispered, "Figures. She wants a mutt instead of food." The warden shifted, uncomfortable. "That's highly unusual. We've had people ask for televisions, guitars, even flights of special food, but no one has ever asked for a dog." Monica did not waver. "You asked me what I wanted. That's what I want." Her words hung in the stale air like a challenge. For Monica, this was not just a request. It was a declaration of who she still was, a black woman who had been denied justice, denied compassion, and denied the benefit of the doubt. They had taken almost everything, but they could not take away her right to love, her right to choose what mattered most at the end. Word of her request traveled fast through the prison. Some guards scoffed, calling it ridiculous, a desperate attempt to grab attention. Others, however, found themselves unsettled. There was something undeniable about her simplicity. She had not asked for luxury, vengeance, or indulgence. She had asked for loyalty. Officer Harris, one of the few black guards in the prison, listened quietly as colleagues mocked the request. Finally, he spoke up, his tone firm. "She's done her time without trouble. Never raised a hand, never started a fight, never tried to run. If this is her last wish, I say we grant it. 10 minutes in the yard, that's all she's asking." Some rolled their eyes, but Harris's words lingered, pressing into the conscience of even the warden. The warden flipped through Monica's file, spotless, no infractions, no violations, no marks against her. A woman who had carried herself with quiet strength in a place designed to break spirits. The warden's reluctant approval of Monica's unusual request sparked immediate conflict within the prison staff, and as word traveled down the halls, the skepticism thickened like smoke. Several of the white officers laughed openly in the break room, shaking their heads at the absurdity of allowing a condemned black woman to see her dog. "She thinks she's special," one sneered, leaning back in his chair. "She thinks she deserves more than the others because she knows how to play the sympathy card." Another chimed in with a cruel smirk. "She wants her mutt because no one else wants to see her. That's all it is." The words carried the sharp edge of prejudice, not just against a prisoner but against the color of her skin, and Monica heard enough whispers in the corridors to know how the guards truly viewed her. They had mocked her for years, and even now when she was asking for something as simple and human as seeing her dog, they found a way to twist it into ridicule. Yet beneath the disdain, there was also a debate unfolding among the more thoughtful officers. Officer Harris, who had already spoken in her defense, argued again in the warden's office. "She has done nothing to cause us harm in 7 years. She follows every rule. She's shown nothing but discipline. This is not a woman who's going to riot or cause trouble. Letting her see her dog is not a weakness, it's a recognition of her humanity, and it's our job to at least allow that much." The warden leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, listening to the arguments bouncing back and forth. On one side were the voices of tradition and suspicion, warning that to allow such an exception would invite danger. On the other side were voices like Harris's, urging compassion and fairness. The conflict revealed how deeply prejudice and mistrust shaped the prison culture. For many, the idea of giving Monica even a sliver of kindness felt like an attack on their authority, as though showing mercy to a black woman condemned for murder might undermine the system they believed in. Monica sat quietly in her cell while these conversations swirled outside, but she was not unaware. The walls of prison carried sound in strange ways, and she caught fragments of conversations, laughter, derision, and sometimes the silence of those who were simply watching. She knew what the white officers thought of her. From the first day she had arrived in shackles, they had looked at her as if her guilt was written in the color of her skin, not in the evidence that had been so carelessly twisted against her. She had grown used to their stares, the dismissive tone when they called her Johnson, as if her name carried no humanity. But still, their contempt burned, and the irony was not lost on her that even in death, she was being judged for asking for something pure. When Officer Collins, tall, stern, and with a reputation for cruelty, learned of her request, he scoffed loudly enough for the entire wing to hear. "A dog in this place? Over my dead body. Rules are rules. No animals, no exceptions. That's what keeps this prison safe. You give her a dog, next someone will ask for a parade." His words carried authority because Collins had been around the longest, a man who had built his career on harsh discipline, the kind of officer who prided himself on breaking inmates down until they were hollow. Monica remembered him well. He had been there the night of her arrest, standing smugly outside the courthouse when the verdict was read. His voice had been one of the loudest celebrating her downfall, and she had never forgotten the way he looked at her, not as a person but as proof of his own power. His resistance to her request was expected, but what struck Monica was not his opposition, it was the fear she saw flicker in his eyes when Duke's name was spoken. For just a second, his composure had cracked, and though he quickly masked it with anger, Monica's instincts told her it was something more than annoyance. Officer Harris noticed it too, though he said nothing at first. Later that evening, as Harris walked Monica from her cell to the small chapel where she was permitted to sit in silence, he leaned slightly closer and spoke in a low voice. "Collins doesn't like this," he said. "Not just because of the rules. Something about Duke unsettles him." Monica tilted her head, her voice soft. "What do you mean?" Harris shook his head. "I can't say for sure, but dogs don't forget, and sometimes they see what people ignore. Watch Collins when Duke arrives." "Just watch." The comment lingered in Monica's mind long after Harris left her in the chapel. She sat in the wooden pew, staring at the dimly lit cross at the front, her thoughts circling. It was true. Duke had always been perceptive, more than any person she had known. He sensed storms before they came, sensed sorrow in her before she admitted it, sensed danger before she saw it. If Duke reacted to Collins, it would mean something. It would mean everything. Meanwhile, the warden convened his officers late into the night, finally deciding that Duke would be allowed into the prison yard the following morning under strict supervision. The decision sparked more mutters and resentment, especially among the white officers who saw it as a bending of the rules for a woman they believed deserved nothing. The next morning dawned gray, the kind of heavy sky that seemed to press down on the prison walls, trapping every sound inside its concrete fortress. Monica Johnson, a black woman who had endured 7 years of captivity and countless days of humiliation, sat on the edge of her cot with her hands trembling slightly, not from fear of death, but from the anticipation of seeing Duke again. She had not closed her eyes the entire night, her mind replaying every memory she had of her golden Labrador, the soft warmth of his fur against her cheek, the way he used to follow her through the park with his tail wagging like a flag, and the loyal eyes that never judged her even when the world had turned its back. Now, with the warden's reluctant approval and Officer Harris's quiet persistence, Duke was being brought to the prison yard under tight security, and Monica knew that these 10 minutes could be the last real ones of her life. The guards escorted her out, their boots clanging on the cement floor, some shaking their heads as if this moment were nothing but a circus show. She could hear their mutters, the sneers of the white officers who had never once looked at her as human. "Can you believe this?" one said under his breath. "All this trouble for a damn dog." Another replied with a cruel chuckle. "She should be grateful they're giving her anything at all." Monica kept her eyes forward, refusing to let their words sink into her skin. She had learned long ago that dignity was a choice, and she would not let them take hers. The prison yard was silent when she entered, the cold morning air brushing against her skin, as if reminding her that she was still alive, still capable of feeling something beyond fear. A single wooden chair had been placed in the center of the cracked pavement, and she was directed to sit. Her wrists were cuffed in front of her, the metal biting lightly into her skin, but the restriction did not matter. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the far gate, waiting for the moment she had dreamed about for years. And then she saw him. Duke emerged between two guards, his golden coat dulled slightly with age, his muzzle flecked with gray. But his eyes, those deep brown eyes, were the same as they had always been, filled with recognition, with longing, with love. His ears perked up the instant he spotted her, his tail wagging tentatively at first, before accelerating into a joyful rhythm. Monica's breath caught in her throat, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to blink away. For years she had been stripped of everything, her freedom, her family, her reputation, but in that moment, all of it dissolved because Duke was still hers. The guards hesitated, waiting for the warden's nod from the observation tower. At last, the nod came, and the leash slackened. Duke lunged forward, pulling the officer nearly off balance, sprinting across the yard with the unstoppable energy of loyalty and love. Monica dropped from the chair to her knees, her cuffed hands outstretched, and the next second Duke crashed into her chest with a force that knocked her backward. His head buried against her neck, his body quivering with joy as whimpers of relief escaped his throat. Monica sobbed openly, her arms wrapping as tightly as the cuffs allowed around her oldest friend. The prison disappeared, the walls, the guards, the ticking clock counting down to her execution, none of it existed anymore. There was only Duke's fur against her face, the earthy scent of him filling her lungs, and the warmth that reminded her of home. She pressed her cheek against his head, whispering through her tears, "You remember me, don't you, boy?" "You never forgot," Duke whined, licking her chin, his tail thumping against the concrete as if trying to reassure her that no matter how many years had passed, nothing between them had changed. Around them, the guards watched in silence. Some shifted uncomfortably, their arms crossed, unwilling to admit that the scene touched something deep they had buried under layers of prejudice. Others looked away, embarrassed by the lump in their throats. Even the warden, hardened by years of watching men and women go to their deaths, felt the sting of something human that prison life rarely allowed. But among the observers, not every face softened. Officer Collins stood rigid near the gate, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting between Monica and Duke with a tension that did not go unnoticed. Duke, sensing something, stiffened suddenly in Monica's arms. His joyful energy drained in an instant, his body going rigid, ears tilting forward, and a low growl beginning to vibrate from his chest. Monica felt it before she heard it. The warning rumbled deep and primal, the kind of sound Duke had only ever made when danger lurked. She followed his gaze and saw that it was locked on Collins, unwavering and sharp. Collins shifted, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression icy. "Control your dog," one of the guards muttered nervously, stepping closer. But Monica placed her hand gently against Duke's back, whispering softly, "Easy, boy. It's okay." Only she knew it wasn't. Duke had never been wrong, and he had never growled without cause. This was not the reaction of a dog confused by strangers. This was recognition, memory, instinct, and Monica knew it. Her heart raced, her tears drying on her cheeks as suspicion stirred inside her. Why was Duke reacting this way to Collins? What did he sense? What did he remember? And why did Collins, the man who had fought hardest to deny her request, now look so unsettled? The growl that rose from Duke's chest reverberated through the prison yard like a sound pulled from the earth itself, low and deep and filled with a menace that turned every head. Monica Johnson, still kneeling on the cold pavement with her arms around her dog, froze as she felt the vibration through his ribs. His body, once trembling with joy, had gone stiff, his tail stopping mid-wag, his eyes locked on Officer Collins with unshakable intensity. Monica whispered softly, trying to soothe him, but even her voice could not break his concentration. The guards exchanged uneasy glances, some shifting their weight, their hands brushing the batons at their belts, as if the growl of a dog could be as dangerous as an uprising. "Control your dog," one white officer barked, stepping forward, but Monica shook her head, her hand resting firmly on Duke's back. "He doesn't growl for no reason," she said, her voice calm but sharp, filled with a conviction that made the guard hesitate. Collins stood near the gate, tall and stiff, his jaw tight, his hands clasped behind him like he was standing at attention. His face betrayed nothing, but his posture told a different story. There was tension there, a flicker of nerves, a rigidity that Monica noticed immediately. She had grown accustomed to watching faces for truth in a place where words often lied, and in Collins' stillness, she sensed fear. Officer Harris, standing a few yards away, narrowed his eyes. He had been watching Collins since the day before when the man had scoffed at Monica's request and sneered that a dog had no place inside prison walls. Now, seeing Duke's unmistakable reaction, Harris felt a knot of suspicion tighten in his chest. "Funny," Harris murmured to a colleague standing near him. "Collins doesn't like this one bit." His colleague frowned, uncomfortable. "Dogs don't lie," Harris continued, his gaze fixed on the dog whose teeth now flashed white as the growl deepened. Monica pressed closer to Duke, whispering words meant to calm, but also studying Collins from the corner of her eye. Something in her gut told her this moment mattered more than anyone understood. She remembered the way Collins had looked at her during her trial, the way he had smirked when the guilty verdict was read, and the way he had seemed almost triumphant when she was sentenced. Now, 7 years later, Duke was reacting to him not with curiosity but with recognition, and Monica's instincts told her Duke remembered more than she could. Collins cleared his throat and took a deliberate step back, muttering, "The animal needs to be removed." His voice was steady, but Monica heard the crack beneath it, a brittleness that betrayed his mask. The warden, observing from the tower, leaned over the railing and called down, "What's going on?" His tone was sharp, filled with suspicion, and the guards below shifted awkwardly, none willing to answer. Duke's growl filled the silence, a sound so primal it seemed to accuse. Harris finally stepped forward, his voice low but clear enough to carry. "Dogs don't growl without a reason," he said. "And that dog's been waiting 7 years to speak." The warden's eyes darted between Harris, Monica, and Collins, his suspicion growing with every second of tension. Monica, her heart pounding, tightened her grip on Duke's collar, both to steady him and to give herself strength. She knew her time was running out, that every breath brought her closer to death, but this moment felt like a door opening. If Duke had remembered something, if his instincts pointed to Collins, then maybe the truth she had prayed for was finally within reach. She looked into Duke's eyes, saw the fire of recognition there, and whispered to herself, "This isn't the end." The guards began to murmur among themselves, confusion rippling through the yard. Some dismissed it as coincidence, the reflex of an old dog meeting a stranger. But others, especially those who had served long enough to know how often instincts proved right, felt the stirrings of doubt. Collins, sensing the shift, scowled and snapped, "This is ridiculous. End this farce before the animal bites someone." His voice was louder now, but there was no hiding the sharp edge of panic laced through his words. Harris stepped closer to Monica, his eyes never leaving Collins. "You ever seen Duke like this before?" he asked. Monica shook her head, her voice steady despite the storm rising inside her. "Never. Not once. He doesn't growl unless there's danger, and he knows people better than most." Harris nodded grimly, his suspicions hardening into belief. Collins glared at them both, his fists tightening at his sides. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Duke barked a sharp, thunderous sound that echoed against the prison walls and silenced every whisper. The warden's voice cut through the air again, sharp and commanding. "Bring them inside. Now." The spell of the yard broke, guards moving quickly to surround Monica and Duke, ushering them back toward the prison interior. But even as they pulled her away, Monica twisted her head, her eyes never leaving Collins. And what she saw there was not anger or contempt, but fear. The air inside the prison seemed heavier after the incident in the yard, as if Duke's growl had awakened something that had been sleeping for years. The guards moved Monica back to her cell, their boots clattering against the concrete floor, but not even the sound of metal doors slamming behind her could drown out the echo of Duke's warning. She sat on the edge of her cot, her mind replaying every detail. Duke's sudden rigidity, the low thunder of his growl, the way his eyes had locked on Collins, as if the man carried a scent of danger that could not be hidden. For 7 years, Monica had lived under the crushing weight of a conviction she swore was false, forced to wear the label of murderer because the system had decided a black woman from Atlanta was easier to blame than to believe. And now, in the final hours of her life, her dog had given her something no court ever had proof that her instincts were right. The guards outside whispered about what they had seen, their voices carrying through the hallways. Some dismissed it, saying old dogs growl at strangers, but others admitted in hushed tones that there had been something deliberate, something chilling in the way Duke had singled Collins out. Officer Harris, who had stood silently through the confrontation, felt the weight of those seconds pressing on him like a burden. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know that dogs did not lie, that their instincts reached deeper than human eyes could see. That night, when he came to check Monica's cell, he leaned in close to the bars and spoke in a low voice that only she could hear. "Your dog's reaction wasn't nothing," he said. Monica looked up at him, her eyes steady. "I know. Duke never growled without a reason." Harris hesitated, glancing down the hall before continuing. "Collins was on duty the night you were arrested, but when I went back and read the reports, his name wasn't there. It's like he erased himself from the record." Monica's breath caught. She had long suspected that her arrest had not been as clean as the state claimed, but she had never had anything solid to hold on to. Now, for the first time, there was a crack in the wall of lies. "Why would he hide that?" she whispered. Harris shook his head. "I don't know, but your dog knows something. And if Collins was there and didn't admit it, that means there's more to the story." The words sank deep into Monica's chest, filling her with a strange mix of fear and hope. Fear that Collins's involvement was darker than she could imagine, and hope that, after all these years, the truth might finally have a chance to break free. The next morning, Monica was brought once again to the yard under the same strict watch. Duke was waiting this time, sitting calmly at the far end with a guard holding his leash, but the moment Collins appeared at the gate, Duke's hackles rose and his growl returned, sharper and more immediate than before. The other guards shifted uneasily, their eyes darting to Collins, who stood stiffly as though nailed to the ground. "That's not normal," Harris muttered, stepping closer to the warden who had come down from his tower to watch. "The dog remembers him." The warden's brow furrowed, his gaze narrowing on Collins. "Were you there that night?" Collins straightened, his jaw tightening. "I was off duty, passing by. Nothing more." His tone was clipped, but Monica saw the faint tremor in his hand. Duke barked suddenly, a sharp crack of sound that made several guards flinch. The silence that followed was heavier than chains. Harris spoke again, louder this time. "Strange, because a witness just came forward. Says they saw someone looking exactly like Collins leaving the victim's house before the police arrived." Gasps rippled through the small group of guards, and Monica's heart leapt in her chest. For 7 years, she had carried the label of guilty, forced to swallow the world's contempt. But now the first spark of suspicion had shifted. It no longer pointed at her. It pointed at the man who had fought hardest to silence her. Collins's face flushed red, his mouth opening as if to argue, but no words came. Duke growled again, the sound low and steady, his eyes fixed on the officer with an intensity that no one could ignore. The warden's expression darkened, his authority filling the yard like a storm. "We're reopening the case," he said firmly. "Effective immediately, the execution is delayed." Monica felt her knees weaken, the words striking her harder than any blow. Delayed, not cancelled, not freedom, but for the first time in years, hope surged through her veins. The world tilted, and she sucked in a breath as though her lungs had just remembered how to work. Collins glared at her, his eyes burning with hatred, but she no longer cared. For the first time, the weight of inevitability had lifted, replaced by the fragile but powerful possibility that the truth could finally break through. She buried her face in Duke's fur, whispering against his ear, "You did it, boy. You made them see." Around her, the guards shifted uneasily, the balance of power tilting in ways they had never expected. The warden's declaration that the execution was delayed spread through the prison like wildfire, stirring unease in some and outright anger in others. But for Monica Johnson, it was the first breath of hope she had drawn in 7 years. She sat in her cell that night, Duke curled at her feet on a thin blanket the guards had reluctantly allowed him, listening to the endless sounds of metal doors clanging and voices echoing down the corridors. Yet for the first time, those sounds did not crush her. She had lived for so long under the certainty of death, under the finality of a system that had written her story without caring about the truth. But now, because of Duke, because of a growl that could not be ignored, cracks had appeared in the wall of lies. Her heart raced not with fear but with anticipation. She knew this reprieve was fragile, temporary, but it was real, and that was more than she had dared to dream. The next morning she was led not to the yard but to a small interview room, stark and windowless, its fluorescent lights buzzing like angry wasps. The air was heavy with tension, and Monica knew from the way the guards shifted nervously outside the door that something significant was about to happen. When the door opened, the warden entered first, his face grim and unreadable, followed by Officer Harris, who gave Monica the briefest of nods, a silent assurance that she was not alone. And then Collins stepped inside. His uniform was immaculate, his posture stiff, but his eyes betrayed the storm inside him. He looked not at Monica but at Duke, who was seated loyally at her side, his gaze locked on Collins with unrelenting suspicion. The growl began again, low and dangerous, filling the small room with a vibration that made even the warden pause. The warden's voice was sharp as he gestured for Collins to sit. "Officer Collins," he said, his tone clipped, "there are inconsistencies that need to be addressed. You were reportedly at the crime scene the night Monica Johnson was arrested, yet your name appears nowhere in the official record. Explain." Collins shifted in his chair, his jaw tight. "I was off duty that night. I happened to be in the area. I didn't think it was relevant." His words were precise, rehearsed, but his tone cracked ever so slightly, enough that Monica felt Duke stiffen beside her. The dog's growl deepened, his body angled toward Collins as if preparing to strike. Monica laid a hand on his fur, steadying him, her own heart pounding in her chest. She watched Collins closely, noting the way he avoided her eyes, the way his hands clenched into fists on the table. Harris leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Not relevant?" he repeated, his voice low but cutting. "A man was murdered, evidence was found, and you, an officer of the law, were seen at the scene by a witness who has recently come forward. You expect us to believe you didn't think that mattered?" Collins's eyes flashed, anger replacing his brittle calm. "That so-called witness is mistaken. People think they see things all the time. This is nothing but a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable for a guilty woman." Monica flinched at his words, the contempt dripping from them, but she held her head high. She had endured worse, had endured years of being called worse, but now the difference was that the doubt was no longer hers alone. Others were beginning to see it too. Harris's voice sharpened. "The dog isn't mistaken. He recognizes you. Animals remember, Collins. They remember faces, scents, actions. And Duke has been unwavering since the moment he laid eyes on you." Collins scoffed, forcing a laugh that rang hollow. "We're basing justice on the bark of a mutt now? That's absurd." But the warden was not laughing. His gaze was fixed on Collins, his suspicion clear. "Then explain why your fingerprints were not accounted for." "We've reopened the evidence, Collins. New tests are being run. If your involvement is innocent, then you have nothing to fear." The room fell silent, the only sound the steady growl of Duke, whose eyes never left Collins. Monica felt her pulse quicken, every instinct telling her that the truth was finally pressing against the surface, desperate to break free. Collins shifted again, his composure slipping. A bead of sweat traced down his temple, betraying the calm he tried to project. "I have nothing to hide," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Monica leaned forward, her eyes locked on him, her voice quiet but firm. "Then why does he know you? Why does my dog look at you like he's seen the devil himself? He doesn't lie, Collins. And neither can you, not forever." Collins' gaze snapped to hers, filled with fury, but beneath the rage she saw fear. Fear of exposure, fear of a truth that could not be silenced by authority or uniforms. The warden stood abruptly, his decision clear. Until this investigation is complete, the execution remains suspended. "Officer Collins, you are to remain available for questioning. Any attempt to interfere will result in immediate suspension." Collins opened his mouth to protest, but the warden's glare silenced him. Harris rose, his voice firm as he addressed Monica. The heavy steel door clanged shut behind Collins, and the echo lingered in the interview room long after he had gone, vibrating through Monica Johnson's bones like the faint aftershock of an earthquake. She sat at the table, her wrists still cuffed, Duke pressed loyally against her legs, and for the first time in years, she felt something stronger than resignation coursing through her veins. Hope. It was not freedom, not yet, but it was real, and it filled her chest with a warmth she had almost forgotten. Officer Harris stood nearby, his arms crossed, watching her with a look that carried both gravity and reassurance. "You heard him," Harris said quietly. "He's not steady. That mask is slipping." Monica nodded, her eyes fixed on the door Collins had stormed through. "He's hiding something," she whispered. "Duke knows. He always knows." The warden paced slowly along the far wall, his expression unreadable, but the weight of his decision hung in the air. "The execution remains delayed until further review," he said firmly, glancing toward Monica. "Don't mistake this for a pardon, but there is enough here that demands answers, and answers will be found." Monica bowed her head, her heart pounding with a rhythm that no longer beat to the clock of death, but to the pulse of possibility. That night, back in her cell, she sat cross-legged on her cot with Duke stretched out beside her, his head resting on her lap. She stroked his fur slowly, her mind racing through every memory, every detail of the night she was arrested. She remembered the flashing lights, the shouts, the cold snap of handcuffs around her wrists. She remembered Collins's face, smug in its certainty, standing at the edge of the crowd like a man who had already decided her fate. At the time, she thought his confidence came from the system stacked against her, but now she wondered if it came from something darker knowledge of his own guilt. Duke stirred, his body twitching in his sleep, as if he were chasing something in dreams, and Monica leaned down to kiss the top of his head. "You've given me more than anyone ever has," she whispered. "You've given me a chance." Meanwhile, outside the confines of her cell, the reopening of her case stirred a storm. Whispers spread through the prison, and even beyond its walls, murmurs began to circulate in the community. A black woman condemned to die, her execution delayed because of a dog's instincts and a witness's testimony. People began to ask questions they had not dared to ask before. Reporters sniffed at the edges of the story, and for the first time, Monica's name was spoken not with certainty of guilt, but with doubt, with curiosity, with the faint suggestion that perhaps justice had not been served. Inside the prison, Collins grew restless. His temper flared in small bursts, his usual mask of control cracking under the pressure. Guards whispered that he avoided passing by Monica's cell, that his eyes darted nervously whenever Duke was mentioned. Some even admitted privately that they had begun to question the story they had believed for so long. If Monica was innocent, what did that say about the years they had spent mocking her, dismissing her, treating her as less than human? Harris noticed the shift too. He came to Monica's cell late one evening, leaning against the bars with a somber expression. "There's more coming," he said softly. "They're retesting the evidence, fingerprints, DNA, everything they can. If Collins left anything behind, it's going to show." Monica swallowed hard, her chest tightening with both fear and anticipation. "And if it doesn't?" Harris's gaze softened, but his voice remained steady. "Then we keep pushing. You've got a chance now, and that's more than you had yesterday." She nodded, tears burning her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had cried enough in the past 7 years. Now she needed to be strong, not just for herself, but for Duke, for Harris, for the truth itself. Days stretched on, each one bringing news that chipped away at the mountain of lies. A fingerprint that didn't match hers, fibers that could not be linked to her, a timeline that grew shakier with every detail re-examined. And always, at the center of it all, the silent testimony of a dog who would not stop staring at Collins with a recognition that no one could deny. Monica began to walk differently through the corridors, her head held higher, her steps less heavy. The other prisoners noticed, some whispering behind their hands, some daring to smile at her with a respect they had never shown before. Even the guards who once mocked her grew quieter, their eyes avoiding hers as if ashamed. The tide was shifting, slowly but unmistakably, and Monica felt the current carrying her forward. One afternoon, as she sat in the yard with Duke under the watchful eyes of guards, Harris approached her with a paper in his hand. The days that followed were unlike any Monica Johnson had ever known during her years behind bars, because instead of the monotony of waiting for death, she found herself waiting for news, real news that could change her life. Each morning she woke on her thin cot with Duke curled faithfully beside her, and each morning her heart carried something it had not in 7 long years: anticipation. The prison buzzed with tension, the guards whispering behind closed doors, the warden pacing in his office with stacks of reopened files on his desk, and Officer Harris moving quietly but firmly through the halls, pushing for answers where others had been too afraid to look. The case that had once seemed sealed was unraveling thread by thread, and Monica could feel the weight shifting. She had been condemned because it was convenient, because the system found it easier to point at a black woman with no resources than to search for the real culprit. Now the cracks were widening, and truth, relentless and sharp, was pouring through. One morning Harris arrived at her cell with a folder in his hands, his expression serious but tinged with something like triumph. "They've finished testing," he said, his voice low so the other guards wouldn't overhear. Monica sat up quickly, her heart pounding. Duke raised his head, ears pricked, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. "And?" Harris opened the folder, flipping through the pages before reading aloud. "The fingerprints found on the victim's doorframe do not match yours. They match Collins." Monica gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. For years, she had carried the brand of guilt, the shame of a crime she never committed. But here, finally, was proof. Harris continued, his voice steady. "They also re-examined fibers from the scene. Again, not yours. They tie directly back to a jacket Collins owned at the time, and DNA traces confirm it. He was there, Monica. He was the one." Monica felt tears burn her eyes, but this time they were not tears of despair. They were tears of release, of vindication, of a truth finally surfacing after years in darkness. She pressed her face into Duke's fur, whispering, "You knew, boy. You always knew." Duke whined softly, his tail thumping against the floor as if affirming her words. The news spread quickly, igniting a storm that reached far beyond the prison walls. Reporters swarmed the courthouse, demanding answers. Families of other prisoners began to question how many more lives had been destroyed by lies and prejudice. Civil rights groups picked up her story, calling it a symbol of systemic injustice, of how the color of skin had been used as a weapon to convict the innocent. For Monica, the noise outside was distant but powerful, like thunder rolling toward her, promising a storm of change. Inside the prison, the shift was immediate. Guards who had mocked her now avoided her eyes. Some, ashamed, muttered half-hearted apologies when no one else was listening. Other inmates whispered her name with a kind of reverence, seeing in her fight a reflection of their own struggles. And Collins, once so arrogant, began to unravel. He stormed through the halls, snapping at colleagues, his face flushed with fury. He avoided the yard, avoided Monica's gaze, avoided Duke's growl that seemed to follow him like a shadow. But avoidance was no longer enough. The warden, armed with the evidence, summoned him to a closed hearing. Monica was not present, but she heard later from Harris that the confrontation was explosive. Collins denied, deflected, raged, but the evidence was undeniable. His fingerprints, his fibers, his DNA, all at the scene where he claimed he had never been involved. The more he denied, the more he exposed himself. When Harris recounted it to her later, his eyes glinted with grim satisfaction. He tried to blame it on contaminated evidence, on sloppy testing, but the lab results were airtight, and when Duke growled at him in front of the panel, they couldn't ignore it. The dog sealed it. Monica laughed through her tears, the sound rusty from years of silence but rich with relief. My dog was the best witness I ever had. Harris smiled faintly. Sometimes loyalty is stronger than words. Within days, charges were filed. Officer Collins was arrested for perjury, evidence tampering, and ultimately for the murder Monica had been convicted of. The news sent shockwaves through the prison and the community beyond. A man who had worn the uniform of law and authority was revealed to be the true criminal, and a black woman who had been cast aside as guilty without proof was suddenly vindicated. Monica's execution was formally canceled, her conviction overturned, and though the legal machinery still moved slowly, the gates of possibility swung wide open. For the first time since her arrest, freedom was no longer a dream, but a destination. The morning she received the official notice, Monica sat in her cell with Duke curled against her side, her hands shaking as she held the paper. Words blurred through her tears. Conviction vacated, release pending. She whispered them aloud, tasting them like honey, like salvation. Duke barked once, sharp and joyful, as if celebrating with her. She pulled him close, burying her face in his fur, whispering, "We made it, boy. We're almost there." Yet even as joy swelled inside her, grief walked beside it. 7 years stolen, her mother buried without her, her family fractured, her dignity dragged through mud, all of it could never be undone. But she refused to let grief win. Instead, she chose to focus on the truth, on the freedom that lay ahead, on the chance to step into the world not as a victim, but as a survivor, a fighter, a woman who had endured and triumphed. Harris came to her cell that night, his expression softer than she had ever seen. "It's done," he said simply. The morning of her release arrived with a brightness Monica Johnson had not seen in years, the sky above the prison painted in shades of gold and blue, as though the universe itself wanted to mark the moment with something more than ordinary daylight. She stood in the processing room with Duke sitting obediently at her side, his tail sweeping the floor like a metronome of joy, and for the first time since her arrest, she felt the weight of shackles lifted from her wrists. The cold bite of steel that had been her constant companion was gone, replaced by the warm thrum of blood rushing freely through her veins. Her hands trembled as she signed the final papers, her name written in ink that no longer felt like a brand of shame, but like the reclaiming of her identity. Around her, officers moved with mechanical efficiency, some refusing to meet her eyes, others glancing quickly and looking away, their faces shadowed with embarrassment. For years they had mocked her, dismissed her, treated her as guilty beyond question, and now they were forced to release her with nothing more than a few murmured instructions and a stack of paperwork. The irony stung, but Monica refused to dwell on bitterness. She was leaving them behind, leaving the gray walls, the narrow cells, the fluorescent lights that hummed like ghosts of despair. She was walking into something new, something earned by survival, loyalty, and truth. Harris was there, standing near the door, his uniform crisp, but his expression softer than she had ever seen. He offered her a nod, not of authority but of respect. "You're free," he said simply, the words landing like a benediction. Monica swallowed hard, her throat thick with emotion. "I don't even know what that means anymore," she admitted. Harris's gaze flicked to Duke, who sat proudly at her side, eyes bright and ears perked. "It means you walk out that door with him. It means you get to decide who you are without anyone else writing the story for you." Monica felt tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them back. She wanted to step into freedom not as a woman broken, but as a woman whole, a woman who had endured and come out stronger. The door buzzed, the locks disengaging with a sound that made her heart lurch, and then the gate swung open. For a moment she stood frozen, staring at the world beyond, the sunlight spilling across the ground like a river she had not touched in years. Duke tugged gently at his leash, urging her forward, and she took a step, then another, until the threshold was behind her. The air outside hit her face like a baptism, clean and alive, filled with scents she had forgotten. Grass, dust, even the faint sweetness of blooming flowers carried on the wind. Duke barked joyfully, pulling free from the leash to bound ahead, then circling back to press against her legs, as though to remind her this was real. Monica dropped to her knees, burying her face in his fur, the tears she had held back now flowing freely. "We made it, boy," she whispered, her voice breaking with relief and gratitude. "We really made it." Around her, cameras clicked, reporters shouted questions, their microphones thrust forward like weapons of curiosity, but Monica barely heard them. For her, the noise was distant, irrelevant. All that mattered was Duke's heartbeat against her chest and the knowledge that she was no longer defined by chains. Harris stepped out behind her, raising a hand to shield her from the reporters, his voice firm as he barked orders to clear a path. "Give her space. She's been through enough." Monica looked up, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment she saw not just an officer but an ally, a man who had chosen to stand with truth instead of prejudice. She nodded her thanks, words unnecessary. As she stood, Duke at her side, Monica felt the enormity of the moment wash over her. She was not just walking free, she was carrying with her the truth of survival, the proof that injustice could be fought, the reminder that love and loyalty could overcome even the darkest lies. She walked past the cameras, past the fences, past the place that had stolen 7 years of her life, and every step felt like a reclamation. Every step felt like power. Beyond the crowd, she saw a small group of supporters holding signs that read, "Justice for Monica," and "Truth wins." Strangers cheered, their voices lifting her name not in condemnation, but in celebration. Monica's knees nearly buckled at the sight, overwhelmed by the knowledge that she was no longer alone, no longer silenced. The community that once ignored her was now rising to embrace her. Duke barked again, tail wagging furiously as if he too understood the significance of the cheers. Monica raised her hand in a small wave, her voice steady as she called out, "Thank you." It was all she could manage, but it was enough. Harris leaned close, speaking softly so only she could hear. "This is your moment. Don't let anyone take it from you again." Monica nodded, her jaw tightening with resolve. "I won't," she said firmly. "Not ever again." They moved her quickly into a waiting car, Duke leaping in beside her, his tongue lolling happily as he pressed against her shoulder. As the vehicle pulled away, Monica turned to look back at the prison one last time. The gray walls loomed in the distance, but instead of fear or sorrow, she felt only release. She had survived those walls. She had beaten them. She turned forward again, facing the open road, the horizon stretching endlessly before her. Duke nudged her hand, and she smiled through her tears, stroking his fur. "It's just us now," she whispered. And that's enough. The car carried her farther from the life she had been forced to endure, closer to the life she would now choose for herself. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, that scars of the past would not disappear overnight, but she also knew she was no longer defined by those scars. She was defined by the fight she had won, by the loyalty of a dog who had never given up, by the courage to believe in truth even when the world had condemned her. The car carried Monica Johnson farther away from the prison walls, each mile placing more distance between her and the years of anguish that had defined her existence. Yet, as the gray structure faded into the horizon, she felt the weight of those years pressing inside her chest like ghosts unwilling to let go. She rested her hand on Duke's head, his fur warm beneath her palm, his steady breathing grounding her in the present, reminding her that everything she had survived had led to this moment. Freedom was not just walking away from chains, it was reclaiming the right to live, to love, and to be seen as human in a world that had denied her humanity for too long. The city skyline loomed ahead, glinting with sunlight, alive with motion and possibility, and for the first time Monica allowed herself to imagine what life could look like beyond survival. Harris had arranged for her to meet with advocates and supporters, people who wanted to help her find her footing in a society that had stolen 7 years from her, but before she faced them, before she spoke her truth to the world, she needed a moment of quiet, a space where her heart could catch up with the reality her body was already living. The car pulled to a stop at a small park on the edge of town, and Monica stepped out, the air sweet with the scent of grass and blooming flowers, the sound of children laughing in the distance. Duke bounded ahead, running across the open field with a joy that made her heart ache, his golden coat gleaming in the sunlight, his body moving with freedom he had been denied almost as much as she had. Monica followed slowly, each step deliberate, feeling the earth under her shoes, the openness of the sky above her, the absence of walls, bars, and fluorescent lights. She sat on a bench, watching Duke chase after a stray ball thrown by a child who squealed with delight, and for the first time in years she felt something inside her soften. She had been hardened by injustice, by the cold indifference of a system that had branded her guilty because of the color of her skin, but here, in this simple moment of sunlight and laughter, she remembered that the world could still hold beauty. Harris joined her quietly, his uniform slightly rumpled from the long day, his eyes watchful but kind. "They're ready for you," he said, nodding toward the group of people gathering near the park entrance: reporters, activists, lawyers, community members holding signs that read words like hope and justice. Monica took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly, but she did not rise just yet. "All my life I've been told what to do," she said softly. "Where to stand, what to say, who to be. But for once, I want to decide when I'm ready." Harris nodded, respect evident in his silence. Monica turned her gaze back to Duke, who had returned to her side, panting happily, his tail wagging as if urging her forward. She reached down to stroke his fur, her voice low but steady. "He believed in me when no one else did. He carried me through every dark night, and in the end, he proved the truth." Harris's eyes softened. "Sometimes the simplest loyalty is the strongest evidence." Monica smiled faintly, tears pricking her eyes. "And sometimes it's the only thing that keeps you alive." She rose then, squaring her shoulders, and walked toward the waiting crowd with Duke at her side. Cameras flashed, voices called her name, and she raised her hand, not to silence them, but to claim her space. She spoke slowly, her voice firm despite the tremor of emotion beneath it. "7 years ago, I was condemned for a crime I did not commit. I was silenced, dismissed, and treated as guilty because it was easier to believe a lie about a black woman than to search for the truth. But today, I stand here free, not because the system finally did its job, but because loyalty and love refused to be silenced. My dog, Duke, remembered what the world wanted to forget, and because of him the truth was exposed." The crowd grew quiet, the weight of her words settling over them. Monica continued, her voice rising with conviction. "I lost years I will never get back. I lost my mother, who died without seeing me vindicated. I lost time, dignity, and freedom, but I did not lose myself. I am still here. And I will use the time I have left not for bitterness but for building, not for hate but for justice. I want to be a voice for those who are still trapped, who are still silenced, who are still waiting for someone to believe them. If my story means anything, let it mean this: truth cannot be buried forever, and love is stronger than any prison wall." The applause that rose was not polite but thunderous, a wave of sound that washed over her, carrying with it the validation she had been denied for so long. Duke barked, leaping excitedly at her side, as though adding his own voice to the chorus. Monica bent to wrap her arms around him, whispering through her tears, "We did it, boy. We're free, and we're not going to waste it." In that moment she felt the fullness of her journey, the pain, the loss, the injustice, but also the love, the loyalty, and the victory. The end. If Monica's story moved you, take a moment to support the channel. Hit like and subscribe so you never miss the next powerful story of truth, resilience, and justice. Share your thoughts about what part of Monica's journey struck you the hardest, and tell us what you think of the plot. We'd also love to know where you're watching from. Drop it in the comments and join the conversation. Your voice matters here, just like Monica's voice finally mattered in the end.